No one can move that stone? The millionaire challenged him, but Jesus Christ taught him a lesson. By 7:05 a.m., the Texas sun was already unforgiving. Heat shimmered above the red dirt of a massive construction site outside Fort Worth, where a $600 million logistics project had ground to a humiliating halt. 200 workers stood behind yellow safety tape, helmets streaked with dust and sweat, yet none of them were watching the idle cranes or the silent excavators. Every gaze was fixed on the same thing, a boulder, not rubble, not debris. A single colossal stone, rough granite veined with quartz, sitting squarely at the heart of the project, exactly where the main foundation was supposed to be poured. 40 tons of immovable defiance. Chains lay snapped at its base. Fresh scorch marks hinted at failed drilling attempts. The ground around it looked wounded, carved and recarved by machines that had lost the fight. At the edge of the site stood Damian Kessler, the billionaire developer whose name dominated business headlines. His tailored suit was out of place among reflective vests and steel-toe boots. He paced like a general surveying a battlefield he could not control, phone pressed to his ear, investors shouting through the speaker. Every passing minute burned money. Every still second mocked his reputation. Foremen whispered. Engineers avoided eye contact. Some workers crossed themselves quietly. Others muttered that the stone had not appeared on any geological survey, as if it had risen overnight, summoned. Damien lowered his phone and stared at the boulder, jaw tight, pride bruised. He had crushed deadlines, silenced inspectors, and bent systems to his will. Yet here it was, one stone stopping everything. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This was not just an obstacle, it was a warning. And before the day ended, the stone would expose something far heavier than concrete and steel. Something buried, crying out, and impossible to ignore. The project was supposed to redefine North Texas. Branded as Lone Star Gateway, it promised to turn empty land outside Fort Worth into the largest logistics hub in the region. Automated warehouses, rail access, thousands of jobs and tax breaks praised by city officials. On paper, it was progress. On the ground, it was pressure. At the center of it all stood Damian Kessler. To the media, he was the embodiment of American ambition. Business magazines called him the king of concrete, a self-made billionaire who built faster than competitors and finished projects months ahead of schedule. Politicians praised his efficiency. Investors admired his numbers. His name carried weight, and weight opened doors. To his executives, Damian was relentless. Meetings began before sunrise. Deadlines were non-negotiable. Time is money, he liked to say, tapping the table as if the phrase itself were law. If a project slowed, someone paid for it. If a budget tightened, corners were cut quietly. No delays, no excuses. To the workers on site, Damian was a distant figure, usually seen from afar, stepping out of black SUVs, flanked by assistants and lawyers. They knew his rules even if they never spoke to him directly. Overtime was expected. Safety complaints were discouraged. Anyone who pushed back found themselves reassigned, reduced, or replaced. There was always someone else waiting for the job. Engineers felt the strain too. Schedules were compressed beyond comfort. Inspections were rushed. Reports were rewritten to keep things moving. When concerns were raised, Damian's response was always calm, always final. Handle it, he would say, and somehow the system did. From a distance, Lone Star Gateway looked like a triumph of modern America. Steel frames rising against the sky, cranes dancing in synchronized precision. But beneath the progress lay a culture built on speed, profit, and silence. Problems were not solved, they were buried. Risks were not eliminated, they were transferred downward. Now, with the project stalled by a single stone, that carefully engineered momentum had vanished. Investors demanded explanations. City officials called hourly. Legal teams drafted statements, searching for language that sounded confident while buying time. On the site, foremen pretended to look busy while workers waited, uneasy, sensing that something was wrong in a way spreadsheets could not explain. Damian watched it all unfold with a tightening in his chest he refused to name. He had faced lawsuits, recessions, even public scandals, and won. Yet this felt different. This was not a negotiation, not a delay he could buy his way out of. For the first time in years, the project was not bending to his will. And though no one dared say it aloud, the silence around that stone felt less like a construction problem and more like the calm before a reckoning, one that would force everyone, especially Damien Kessler, to confront what success had been built upon. Long before the stone appeared, Damien Kessler had built his empire on three unspoken pillars. They were never written in company manuals, never printed in glossy investor decks, yet everyone who worked under him understood them clearly. Speed, profit, silence. Speed came first. Projects were pushed to finish months ahead of schedule, not because it was safe, but because it was impressive. Early delivery won headlines, bonuses, and political favor. Engineers learned to compress timelines until margins vanished. Crews worked double shifts under floodlights, chasing dates that looked good on press releases. If exhaustion led to mistakes, those mistakes were labeled human error and quickly forgotten. Profit was the second pillar, and it governed every decision that followed. Cheaper materials replaced certified equipment. Maintenance schedules were optimized, which meant postponed. Safety gear became an expense to minimize rather than a standard to uphold. When foremen requested replacements or upgrades, the answer was usually a variation of the same phrase, "Make it work." And they did, until something failed. The third pillar was the most powerful of all, silence. Silence meant no paper trails that couldn't be managed. It meant internal reports rewritten in careful language. It meant legal teams standing ready with settlement offers before questions were even asked. Families received checks accompanied by thick folders of documents they barely understood, each page designed to close mouths rather than heal wounds. The sums were enough to quiet a crisis, but never enough to change a life. Within the company, silence was survival. Workers learned which injuries were worth reporting and which were not. Engineers learned when to stop asking questions. Supervisors learned that loyalty was measured not by integrity, but by discretion. Those who spoke too loudly found themselves transferred, demoted, or simply gone. From Damien's perspective, it was all justified. He told himself the same story every powerful man tells eventually, that progress required sacrifice, that risk was unavoidable, that the system rewarded results, not hesitation. If a project succeeded, no one asked how. If it failed, someone else took the blame. Yet the cost accumulated quietly. 8 deaths in 5 years, 8 families changed forever, 8 funerals that never appeared in boardroom discussions. Each time, the machinery of speed, profit, and silence worked exactly as designed. Construction paused briefly, lawyers moved quickly, and then the crane started turning again. By the time Lone Star Gateway broke ground, those pillars were no longer choices. They were habits. They shaped decisions automatically, without reflection or remorse. The empire ran smoothly because it no longer needed conscience to operate. Now standing before a stone that refused to move, Damien felt something unfamiliar pressing in. Not fear of loss, but fear of exposure. The systems that had always protected him were useless against an obstacle that could not be negotiated, buried, or bought off. And though the site remained outwardly calm, beneath the surface the foundations of speed, profit, and silence were beginning to crack, threatened by a truth that had been waiting, patient and heavy, to rise. The cost of those pillars was written in names that never appeared on quarterly reports. The first was Ethan Morales, 29 years old, a second-generation construction worker from El Paso. He fell from a scaffold on a downtown Dallas project when a safety harness snapped mid-shift. The equipment had passed inspection on paper, though the certification sticker was counterfeit. Ethan's body hit concrete 12 stories below. By sunset, the site was shut down. By morning, it was reopened under a new subcontractor name. His mother received a settlement check and a stack of documents explaining that her son's death was the result of operator misuse. Next was Caleb Turner, 38, a night electrician with 2 daughters who waited for him every morning with cereal bowls untouched until he came home. He was electrocuted while installing temporary lighting after a deadline had been moved up to impress a visiting state official. The wiring had not been insulated. The inspection had been signed anyway. Caleb died instantly. His wife was told it was a tragic accident. The compensation covered the funeral and 3 months of rent. Nothing more. The paperwork included a confidentiality clause. Then there was Darius King, 41, crushed beneath a steel beam when an aging crane failed on a Houston site. Maintenance requests had been filed, 3 of them, but repairs were postponed to avoid delays. When the boom snapped, the beam fell, leaving Darius unrecognizable. His co-workers identified him by a tattoo on his forearm. The incident report cited unforeseeable mechanical failure. The crane was quietly sold for parts 2 weeks later. There were others. Names spoken softly at kitchen tables, never in boardrooms. Men who worked weekends and holidays whose bodies gave out before their contracts did. Each death followed the same pattern. Brief shock, swift legal action, clean paperwork. Checks were issued. Files were closed. Silence was restored. Inside the company, these losses were reframed as risks inherent to the industry. Damian Kessler rarely saw the faces attached to the numbers. To him, each case was resolved efficiently. His lawyers called it mitigation. His accountants called it cost control. The machine moved forward. On the ground, the workers remembered differently. They remembered helmets left on lockers, lunch pails never reclaimed, tools that gathered dust. They remembered the unspoken rule to keep heads down and mouths shut. Complaints faded. Grief hardened into caution. Every man learned which corners not to question if he wanted to make it home. Families learned a different lesson, that justice could be delayed, diluted, and documented away. That a life could be reduced to a paragraph of legal language and a signature at the bottom of a page. By the time Lone Star Gateway began, those wounds were buried under layers of concrete and compliance. The past was sealed, protected by forms and filings that declared closure. But wounds do not disappear because they are ignored. They wait. And as the workers stood watching a stone that refused to yield, some of them felt it stirring again. That old, uncomfortable truth that what had been buried was not forgotten. That the ground itself seemed to remember what the paperwork tried so hard to erase. By the 3rd week, the boulder had become an obsession. From an engineering standpoint, there was nothing mystical about it. Surveys identified it as a dense granite mass, heavy but manageable, at least on paper. Calculations were run, load limits confirmed, contingency plans drafted. The solution, everyone agreed, was mechanical. Science always found a way. The first attempt involved the largest excavator in the fleet, its hydraulic arm capable of lifting 30 tons. The machine roared to life, steel teeth biting into the earth around the stone, carving leverage points with methodical precision. For 4 hours it strained, engines screaming under the Texas sun. The ground shook. Dust filled the air. When the operator shut the engine down, hands trembling, the boulder had not moved a fraction of an inch. Chains came next, industrial grade, tested far beyond standard limits. 2 machines pulled in opposite directions, diesel motors growling like wounded animals. Workers stepped back, shielding their faces. The chains stretched, metal shrieking under impossible tension, until one snapped with a crack like a gunshot. It missed 3 men by inches. The stone remained unmoved, as if rooted to the earth itself. Explosives were authorized under controlled conditions. Specialists arrived, measured, drilled, and placed charges calculated to fracture the rock without destabilizing the site. The detonation echoed across the plains, a concussive blast that rattled windows miles away. Smoke rose. Cameras rolled. When the dust settled, the boulder stood exactly as it had before, unmarked, unbothered, almost mocking in its stillness. By then, more than $2 million had been spent trying to make it disappear. Engineers grew quiet. No one wanted to be the next to explain failure. Reports became cautious, filled with phrases like anomalous resistance and unexpected subsurface anchoring. None of it satisfied the investors calling from overseas, demanding timelines Damian could no longer promise. Among the workers, something shifted. Some said the stone was cursed. Others said the land was fighting back. A few older men crossed themselves each morning before clocking in. No one laughed at them. The memory of snapped chains and near misses lingered too close. Damien Kessler refused any explanation that sounded irrational. He stood before the boulder, hands on his hips, jaw clenched, listening to experts search for words that preserved their credibility. He had beaten lawsuits, regulators, and markets. He would not be defeated by a rock. Yet the more machines failed, the more the stone seemed to expose a truth no one wanted to name. This was not a problem that could be optimized away. Science had reached its limit, money had lost its leverage, and in the uneasy silence that followed each failed attempt, the boulder loomed larger than its physical weight, no longer just an obstacle, but a presence, something immovable, insisting on being acknowledged. As the sun dipped low and the site emptied for the evening, the stone remained, unchanged and undeniable. And beneath the surface, where drills could not reach and equations could not account for, something waited, untouched by force, unmoved by power, and no longer willing to stay hidden. It was late Friday morning when the stranger appeared. Security cameras would later show that he walked in through the main gate without hesitation, as if he belonged there. No badge, no escort, just steady footsteps across churned red dirt while the site buzzed with tension, installed machinery. Some workers noticed him immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't. He looked like one of them, worn jeans faded at the knees, work boots coated with dust from miles of road, a plain white cotton shirt, sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms marked by labor, not gym routines. His hands were rough, calloused in a way that couldn't be faked. Dark hair brushed his shoulders. A short beard framed a face neither young nor old, ordinary enough to be overlooked, until someone met his eyes. Those eyes lingered. They were calm, unnervingly so, holding a depth that made men avert their gaze without knowing why. He stopped near the perimeter tape, where foremen argued quietly, and engineers checked phones that kept ringing. When a security guard approached, ready to escort him out, the stranger spoke first. His voice was steady, warm, unmistakably American, yet impossible to place. "I'm looking for work." The guard hesitated. There was no sarcasm in the man's tone, no desperation either, just certainty. Word traveled fast. Within minutes, the stranger stood 20 yards from the boulder, directly in Damien Kessler's line of sight. Damien was mid-call with a furious investor from Seoul, his voice clipped, patience gone. When he noticed the man waiting, unannounced, unbothered, something inside him snapped. "What now?" Damien barked, ending the call. "Who let him in?" No one answered. No one claimed responsibility. The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't shrink under Damien's glare the way others did. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. "I heard you need help," he said. A few workers exchanged glances. "Help? With what? Moving the stone no machine could touch?" Damien laughed once, short and sharp, the sound of a man running on caffeine and control. "You picked a bad day to ask for a job." The stranger nodded slightly as if he already knew that. Bad days are usually when the truth shows up. The words landed oddly in the air. Not confrontational, not polite, just final. Damien stepped closer, studying the man as one might inspect a tool of questionable quality. He saw the calloused hands, the straight posture, the lack of fear. He saw a target. Around them, the sight grew quiet. Workers sensed what was coming. They had seen that look on Damien's face before, the look that preceded public humiliation, disguised as leadership. "What kind of work do you think you can do here?" Damien asked. The stranger glanced once at the massive stone, then back at the billionaire. "Whatever needs to be done." No bravado. No challenge. Just an answer. Damien smiled, thin and predatory. In that moment, the chaos of failed machines and unanswered questions found an outlet. The stone had embarrassed him. This man would pay for it. Unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of what he was stepping into, the stranger remained still as the heat pressed down and 200 witnesses watched. What none of them understood yet was that this was not a man walking into a trap. It was judgment walking onto the site, disguised as a worker looking for a job. Damien didn't raise his voice at first. He didn't need to. He turned slowly, scanning the site with a practiced sense of command, and motioned for the foreman to gather everyone. "All hands over here," he said, loud enough to carry. "I want witnesses." Work stopped. Radios went silent. 200 men drifted closer, forming a loose semicircle around the boulder, boots crunching on gravel. They recognized the tone. This was not a meeting. This was a spectacle. Damien faced the stranger and smiled, a sharp, rehearsed expression that never reached his eyes. "You said you're looking for work," he began, projecting his voice so no one could miss a word. "That's good. I admire initiative." A few workers shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the ground. Damien gestured theatrically toward the stone. "You see this?" He let the question hang. 40 tons. We brought in the best machines money can buy, spent millions, didn't move. He circled the stranger slowly, like a man appraising livestock. "But you—" Damien stopped in front of him. "You look strong, hands like a laborer. I'm guessing you've moved plenty of rocks in your life." No one laughed. The silence felt thick. "So here's my offer," Damien continued, louder now. "If you can move that stone, even 1 inch, with your bare hands, no machines, no tricks, I'll pay you double what my chief engineer makes. Full benefits, company truck, everything." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The numbers were obscene compared to what most of them earned in months. Damien's smile widened. "But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll crawl from that stone to the front gate, on your knees, 300 yards, and everyone here will watch." Several men looked away. One worker clenched his jaw. Another shook his head slightly, as if hoping the stranger would walk away before it was too late. The stranger didn't move. His expression didn't change. Damien waited for fear. He waited for anger. He got neither. "I accept," the man said calmly. A sharp laugh burst from Damien's throat. "Of course you do." He leaned in closer. "You people always think you're special." The stranger lifted his gaze, meeting Damien's eyes without flinching. "I accept," he repeated, "but with one condition." That earned a reaction. Damien barked a laugh, loud and mocking. "A condition?" He spread his arms. "You're in no position to negotiate. When the stone moves," the stranger continued, as if Damien hadn't spoken, "you will kneel before every worker here. You will ask forgiveness for the wages withheld, the hours stolen, the dignity stripped away." A hush fell over the site. Damien's face flushed red. For a moment, something like disbelief flickered across his features. Then it hardened into rage. "What did you say to me?" "And if the stone doesn't move," the stranger added quietly, "I will crawl as you demand. But as I crawl, I will tell you why it couldn't move, and you will listen." 200 pairs of eyes darted between them. Damien's fists clenched. No one had ever spoken to him like that in public. Yet backing down was unthinkable. Not here, not now. "Deal," he snapped. "Let's get this over with." The stranger nodded once. What Damien didn't notice was how the air had changed, how the workers stood straighter, how some felt a weight lift they couldn't explain. What he thought was a humiliation about to unfold was something far more dangerous. Because this wager was never about strength. It was about truth. The stranger did not walk toward the boulder. That alone unsettled the crowd. Instead, he remained where he was, feet planted in the dust, eyes fixed on the stone, as if listening rather than measuring. Minutes passed. The Texas heat pressed down harder. Somewhere a radio crackled and went silent again. Damien folded his arms, impatience curdling into contempt. "Well," Damien snapped, "what are you waiting for? Divine intervention?" The stranger's voice answered without turning. "Not intervention, revelation." A few workers exchanged uneasy looks. This was not how a man preparing to fail behaved. The stranger took one slow step forward, then stopped again, still not touching the stone. "I won't move it with my hand," he said. "I won't need to." Damien scoffed. "You agreed to the terms." "And you agreed to hear the truth," the stranger replied. His voice carried now, deeper, steadier, cutting through the sight without effort. "This stone does not move because it marks something you tried to bury." The word bury rippled through the semicircle of men. The stranger turned at last, facing Damien directly. Those close enough saw the change in his eyes. Not anger, not accusation, but an authority that did not ask permission. "This is not an obstacle," he said. "It is a grave marker." Damien's smile faltered. "That's enough," he said too quickly. "You're stalling." "Under this ground," the stranger continued, each word landing with measured weight, "are three of your workers." A murmur surged, sharp and frightened. "Alive," the stranger said. Damien took an involuntary step back. "That's impossible." The stranger named them anyway. First and last names, ages, details no one outside a sealed circle should have known. He spoke of a sealed section closed in a hurry, of an inspection coming, of concrete poured too fast, of men trapped below, counting hours in darkness, faces drained of color. A foreman's clipboard slipped from his hand and hit the dirt. Damien shook his head violently. "You don't know what you're talking about." The stranger raised his right hand. In the bright sun, the marks were unmistakable. Wounds that pierced the palm clean through, old yet vivid, surrounded by the rough calluses of a working man. The air seemed to thin. Several workers dropped to their knees. Others crossed themselves, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. "I heard them," the stranger said softly, "for 14 days. Their prayers, their fear, their hope, and I came." Damien's breath came shallow. "Who are you?" he whispered. The stranger's gaze did not soften. "The one you mocked when you thought power answered to money alone?" He looked past Damien to the men standing behind him. "Dig," he instructed calmly. 3 meters east, 45 degrees down. You'll find the seal." No one waited for permission. Shovels moved. Hands shook. Dirt flew. The stranger turned back to Damien. "You demanded that I crawl if I failed," he said. "I did not fail. You did." Damien's knees buckled, but pride held him upright, for now. "When they are brought up alive," the stranger said, voice low and certain, "you will kneel. Not for me, for them. For every man whose dignity you took and called it efficiency." The wager had flipped completely. What Damien had meant as a public humiliation had become a summons. And as the ground began to open where the stranger had pointed, one truth became unavoidable. The stone had never been waiting to be moved. It had been waiting for him to fall to his knees. The digging began with disbelief and ended in terror. Shovels struck the ground exactly where the stranger had indicated. 3 meters east, angled downward. At first there was only dirt, heavy and dry. Then the sound changed. A dull, unnatural thud echoed up the handles. Not soil, not stone, concrete. The workers froze. Someone whispered, "That's not on the plans." Another voice answered, barely audible, "It was never supposed to be." They cleared the earth with shaking hands until a flat slab emerged, reinforced, sealed, deliberate. A structure meant to close something off permanently. The air around the pit felt wrong, thick with a silence that pressed against the chest. The stranger stepped closer and knelt beside the slab. He placed his ear against the concrete, eyes closed, listening. The entire site held its breath. Then it came. 3 faint knocks. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was so weak that some thought they imagined it. Others knew immediately. A cry tore through the crowd, raw, unfiltered disbelief. Men who had survived collapses and storms staggered backward, hands over mouths. A foreman dropped to his knees, sobbing openly. "They're alive," someone said, voice breaking. Damien Kessler stood frozen, his face drained of color, lips moving without sound. The certainty he had built his life on, contracts, signatures, legal language, collapsed in an instant. The stranger rose slowly and turned to him. "This boulder," he said, his voice carrying with terrifying calm, "is a marker of a grave. Not for the dead you already buried in paperwork, but for the living you tried to erase." He spoke their names again, each one cutting deeper. He spoke of darkness, of counting breaths, of sharing crumbs and drops of water that should not have existed. He spoke of prayers whispered into concrete walls, prayers that had no audience on earth. "I heard every one of them," he said, "and I came." The workers followed his gaze back to the stone. It no longer looked like an obstacle. It looked like a headstone, massive, immovable, accusing. Machines couldn't move it, the stranger continued, because it was never meant to be moved by force. It was meant to be revealed. He lifted his hands again. In the bright Texas sun, the wounds were unmistakable. Pierced palms surrounded by the hardened skin of a laborer. The marks of nails. The marks of work. The marks of sacrifice. A murmur spread, then silence fell as understanding crashed over the sight like a wave. This ground cried out, the stranger said, and heaven answered. Behind him, workers scrambled to drill a small opening, just enough to let air in. As the bit broke through, a rush of stale air escaped, followed by a hoarse voice from below. "We're here," it cried. "Please, we're here." Men wept openly. Some prayed aloud. Others stood stunned, unable to move, staring at the stranger as if afraid to look away. Damien's knees finally gave out. He sank into the dirt, suit ruined, power stripped bare. The boulder remained unmoved, but everything else had shifted, because what stood exposed now was not just a crime, but a truth no amount of money could bury, and no stone could silence. The rescue unfolded with a precision no blueprint had ever captured. At the stranger's command, the drilling stopped. "Slowly," he said, raising one hand. "The air below is thin." His voice cut through the frenzy, steadying men whose hands shook with urgency. They widened a small opening, just enough. Stale air rushed upward, heavy with the scent of confinement and fear. Then, unmistakably, a human voice rose from the darkness. "We're here," it rasped. "Please, we're here." The sound broke something open across the sight. Hard men cried without shame. Others dropped to their knees. A medic shouted orders. Oxygen hoses were lowered. Time narrowed to the rhythm of breath. Counted, protected. As the opening widened, flashlights pierced the void. The space below revealed itself. An emergency shelter never meant to be sealed, 4 by 5 meters. Concrete walls sweating with moisture. 3 figures huddled together, skeletal with exhaustion, eyes reflecting light like startled animals. They were alive. Rescuers moved with care, guided by the stranger's quiet instructions. How to brace the edge, where to cut, when to pause. A stretcher went down first. Anthony Caldwell, leg twisted and swollen, was lifted carefully, his jaw clenched against pain. As he emerged into sunlight, a roar of relief surged through the crowd. Next came Jordan Pike, barely able to stand, lips cracked, hands trembling as he clutched a rescuer's arm. He blinked against the glare, whispering a name over and over like a prayer. Last was Miguel Reyes. He insisted on climbing partway himself, stubborn even now. When his head broke the surface, he scanned the faces. Engineers, workers, medics, until his eyes locked on the stranger. Miguel stopped. Tears cut clean lines through the dust on his face. He took 2 unsteady steps forward and dropped to his knees. "You came," he said, voice breaking. "You told us to hold on, every night." The sight fell silent. Miguel spoke haltingly, words tumbling out between sobs. He told of darkness that erased time, of counting breaths to stay awake, of 3 granola bars shared across days, of water that shouldn't have been there, drops seeping from pipes they knew were dry, of pain that eased just enough to sleep when despair threatened to take them. "And you were there," Miguel said, lifting his eyes. "In our dreams, you said one more day, every day." The stranger knelt and lifted him gently to his feet. "Your faith carried you," he said softly. Miguel shook his head. "No, you did." Nearby, Jordan nodded weakly, recognition flooding his face. Anthony, pale on the stretcher, raised a trembling hand. "My mother," he whispered. "She prayed all night," the stranger replied, taking his hand, "and she was heard." Sirens approached at last. Paramedics moved in, efficient and reverent, as if aware they were stepping onto holy ground. As the men were loaded into ambulances, cheers rose, then quieted into awe. The boulder still stood, unmoved, but the impossible had already happened. What had been sealed was opened. What had been silenced was heard. And under the Texas sun, 3 lives returned to the light. Testimony that no grave, no concrete, no power on earth can outlast the reach of Jesus Christ. The ambulances pulled away, sirens fading into the distance, but the site did not return to motion. No machines restarted, no orders were given. 200 men remained where they stood, dust-streaked and silent, as if afraid that moving too soon would break whatever had just been revealed. Damien Kessler tried to speak. "It's over," he managed, voice thin. "They're alive. You proved your point." The stranger turned, and the calm that had guided the rescue hardened into something sharper. Not anger, not cruelty, but truth without padding. "They are alive despite you," he said. "Not because of you." Damien flinched. "You thought a miracle would cancel consequence?" The stranger continued. "That mercy would erase accountability. That is not how justice works." He stepped closer, and Damien shrank under a presence that felt heavier than the stone behind them. "You sealed men underground to protect a schedule. You signed papers to protect a name. You bought silence and called it closure." Damien shook his head, tears streaking the dust on his face. "I'll pay," he said quickly. "Whatever it costs. Name it." "Money is easy," the stranger replied. "You've given it without feeling for years. What's required now will hurt." He raised his voice so all could hear. "Justice is not undone by miracles. Miracles reveal what justice must address." Then he named them. One by one, the names of workers who had died under Damien's projects were spoken aloud. Men reduced to case numbers, now restored to memory. Ages, families. The small details no report had bothered to include. With each name, Damien's shoulders curled inward, as if struck. "You remember none of them," the stranger said. "But I do." Damien collapsed to his knees. "This is the price," the stranger said, measured and exact. "First, you will confess publicly. Not a statement written by lawyers. You will stand before the nation and name what you did. Every death, every lie, every corner cut." Damien nodded, sobbing. "Second, restitution. Not settlements designed to silence. Families will receive support worthy of lives stolen, education, health care, dignity restored. The living will receive care for the wounds you inflicted." "Yes," Damien whispered, "all of it." "Third, you will dismantle what you built on blood," the stranger continued. "The empire that rewarded your cruelty will not survive your repentance. Assets sold, profits surrendered, a foundation created, not bearing your name, to protect workers you once treated as expendable." Damien's breath hitched, but he nodded again. "And fourth," the stranger said, lowering his voice, "you will work." Damien looked up, confused. "You will labor with your hands," the stranger said. "Minimum wage, no privilege, 2 years. You will learn the weight of what you demanded from others. You will feel the heat, the fatigue, the dependence on mercy from strangers. Only then will your heart begin to change." The site was utterly silent. Damien bowed his head to the dirt. "I accept," he said. "Not bargaining now, not performing, simply broken." The stranger placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, not gentle. "I forgive you," he said. "That forgiveness was given long before this day. But forgiveness does not cancel justice. It walks with you through it." He gestured to the stone. "You asked why it would not move. Stones do not shift to save pride. They wait for hearts to break." Damien remained kneeling as the truth settled around him. The miracle had not erased his guilt. It had exposed it. And for the first time he understood. Mercy had opened the door, but justice was the road he would have to walk. Behind him, the boulder stood exactly where it was. Unmoved. Waiting. 6 weeks later, the confession shook the country. Damien Kessler did not stand behind a podium of polished wood or hide behind legal language. He sat in a simple chair before cameras and reporters, hands visible, voice unprotected. He named the dead. He described the shortcuts. He admitted sealing men underground to protect a timeline. He submitted documents, emails, signatures, his own. Markets reacted instantly. Partners fled. Headlines turned merciless. The empire collapsed the way it had been built. Quickly. Justice moved. Families were notified. Funds were established, not bearing his name. Medical care was arranged, education secured. Independent inspectors took over projects across the region. And when the attention moved on, Damien did not. He went to work. not as an executive but as a laborer. Steel-toe boots that blistered his feet, gloves that split his palms, Texas heat that pressed him flat by noon. He mixed concrete, hauled rebar, waited for paychecks that barely stretched to groceries. Men who once feared him shared water bottles and jokes, unaware at first of who he had been. Over time, they learned and kept working beside him anyway. 2 years passed. The boulder remained. Then one quiet evening, Damien returned alone to the site where everything had begun. The cranes were gone. In their place stood a small memorial garden, trees, benches, a bronze plaque etched with names, those who died and those who were saved. The stone still sat at the center, unchanged, massive, undeniable. Footsteps approached behind him. The man in the white shirt stood there as if he had never left, dust on his boots, hands marked by work and wounds, eyes steady with a kindness that did not soften truth. "You kept your word," he said. Damien nodded. "I learned how heavy a shovel is," he replied. "How long a day can be. How a man measures time by pain and hope." The man looked at the stone. "It was never about strength," he said. "Only surrender." Damien swallowed. "What happens now?" "You choose," came the answer. "Comfort without change, or vocation shaped by what you learned." The choice had already been made. As Damien stood, the ground trembled, not violently, not dramatically. The stone shifted, just enough. A low sound rolled through the earth as it settled downward, sinking until its top formed a broad, level seat. A bench, a place to rest, not lifted, lowered. The man placed his hand on the stone. "Stones move when hearts move," he said. "Power bows when pride breaks. And what was meant to bury truth becomes a witness to it." Damien felt it then. Not triumph, not relief, but peace earned through obedience. The impossible had not yielded to force. It had yielded to repentance. When he turned back, the man was already walking away, fading into the dusk. His words lingered. "Every time you choose people over profit, you walk with me." The stone remained half-sunk, a permanent reminder, not of power, but of humility. Not of punishment, but of a mercy that insists on justice, and a justice that makes room for mercy. If this story moved something in you, if it challenged how you think about forgiveness, accountability, or the weight of a changed heart, don't let it end here. Like this video and subscribe to Stories of Grace so you won't miss the next story where faith meets real life and transformation begins where pride finally kneels.